what God can do with little. You may think you haven't got much, but I'm going to show you that God can do something incredible with whatever little you think you might have, and when you put it into the hands of God. So there's an amazing story found in John chapter 6, and known as the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. John 6 verse 5. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Then verse 9 to 13. "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down," in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain." They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets. We see here what God can do with little, when that little is placed in his hands. When we understand this principle and give what little we think we have of our talents, of our time, of our love, of our money, whatever it is, if we give it to the hands of God, we're going to see that God can do amazing, amazing things with very, very little. He's a God of multiplication. And one of the great revelations that we can have in the Christian life is that God does not need a lot from us. We don't have to be highly gifted, highly talented, the best preacher, the best singer, the best leader, or the best anything. All he needs from us, give him what you've got, whatever's in your hand. Because so often we don't think we've got a lot to offer, and that is absolutely fine because God doesn't need a lot. But usually what we've got to offer is actually a lot more than we realize it is, and especially when we know what God can do with it. So in this passage of Scripture, the feeding of the 5,000, we see how 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, when placed into God's hands, could feed 5,000 people. And that's just the men, let alone the woman and the children, I guess. So here's a thought for you. God can take a nobody and make them into a somebody. D.L. Moody was born very poor, became an orphan at a very early age, left school at 13, worked as a shoe salesman in Chicago. In his church, listen to this, he is spoken of as one of the most spiritually dull people in the congregation, with very little hope of the future. That's how he was perceived. Truly, he was a nobody. But he decided to place the very little he had unreservedly into the hands of God. He began collecting strays off the streets of Chicago to attend his Sunday school class. Well, that class of hoodlums grew to 2,000 people. Moody became a great evangelist. Before he died, they estimate he reached 1 million people for Christ. Truly a nobody in the hands of God became a somebody. Now, most of us aren't going to achieve what Moody did, but the principle still applies. Give God the little you've got and watch it multiply. William Carey is another example who wanted to be used by God, but was once criticized for being, well, he's just a shoemaker. Do you know what his answer was? Not even a shoemaker. He said, I only repair shoes. Put himself at the bottom of the pile. He had little formal education and no social standing, but he placed his life at God's disposal for the evangelization of India. He worked on Bible translation and production, on evangelism, church planting, education, and medical aid. Before he died, they say he translated the scriptures into 36 languages, considered by some to be the modern-day father of missions. And nobody placed into the hands of God became a somebody. My encouragement for you this week is whatever God has given to you, no matter how small it may seem or look like to you, and you might think, well, there's nothing we can do with this, give it over to God and watch how God can multiply it and do amazing things through the little that you place into his hands.